the business community cares deeply about education because today's students are tomorrow's workforce. During the pandemic, the poor condition of schools in Boston was highlighted and is in need of significant capital investment. Before spending hundreds of millions of dollars in school infrastructure, do we have too many school buildings? As mayor, how would you address, for example, the results of the 2015 audit that revealed that BPS should consolidate some schools?
What we do have is we have a major problem with our facilities, and we don't have the right facilities. We don't have the right buildings. When you look at it from a square footage standpoint, Jim, we have buildings that are not appropriately designed for the needs of today. It's not that we have too much square footage. What we have is a poor distribution of students in certain buildings. We have space that we're not using in certain ways. We do need to spend a lot of money and time to upgrade our facilities. And this is something that we should do urgently. What we'll find is that we're going to need some swing space to make sure that we don't disrupt education while we're building new facilities, but that ultimately we will increase the footprint of many of our schools because we will need theater space. We're going to need art studios. We're going to need science labs. We're going to need space that we don't currently have in the old designs of our school buildings that need to happen. So the school footprint will grow, and I think the number of facilities will shrink. But we need to do it in a way by recognizing that when you build a new school, as the city did, for example, with the new Dearborn STEM Academy, it's a gorgeous school with appropriate space. But we needed swing space. We need to make sure that those students are somewhere else while we're building. So let's use the fact that we have excess space, get the students in those swing space, grow the footprint of our schools, and then downsize the number of buildings.
We absolutely have to address the fact that we have declining enrollment. We actually just lost 2,000 families, which I think is the sharpest decline in the last 15 years. And frankly, I think that is absolutely depressing because what it tells me is that families are really fed up, I think, with Boston Public Schools not delivering an excellent education for their child. And so if we're going to change that, we're going to have to, of course, address the fact that we do have too many buildings. And I think some of that consolidation has already happened under our current superintendent in the way we're reconfiguring grade levels. But I think that we need to think more comprehensively. One, we should make sure, of course, every single building that our children and educators go into is safe and is clean and doesn't have, say, asbestos in it. I have some buildings in my district that actually still have asbestos. So I think with this infusion of federal dollars, this is an opportunity for us to make those investments. I have been saying for months, even when our former mayor, Marty Walsh, was still here, that we should be accelerating some of these school projects because interest rates were low. And we should be using a substantial amount of the federal dollars that are coming in for these infrastructure projects so every child has a safe building to attend school in, and every educator also feels safe. But the second piece that's critically important is I put out a report 3 years ago, before I was a candidate for mayor, on ways in which to close the inequities within our Boston public schools. My record of accomplishment on really pushing for the improvement of Boston public schools stands out compared to every other candidate in this race. And I'm passionate about it because I went to 5 excellent Boston public schools. And I often say, but for the grace of God and the education I got in those schools, I would not have made it to a Princeton University. I would not have been successful. So I know what's possible. And so this plan I put out 3 years ago, I would simply implement immediately if blessed to become the next elected mayor. And it includes greater investments in universal pre-K and childcare, and starting an initiative from birth to 5, where every family has access. We can do that working in partnership with our employers and the business community. Redesigning our high schools, so we are creating pathways and developing young people who have the skill sets to go into the jobs now, particularly in tech, the trades, life sciences, biotech, you name it, but also the jobs of the future. And right now we've been talking about Madison Park for years. We need more than one Madison Park. We need a vo-tech system within Boston Public Schools where Madison Park is frankly the center of that hub. And we need greater investment in these pathways, along with access to internships and opportunities for our students to gain certifications and credits from local colleges while still at BPS. So they can leave BPS and actually go into some of these jobs without necessarily having to even go to college and incur debt. And I know the business community cares deeply about that, as do I.
No, that's a great question. We think about our schools' facilities, we think about capacity, we think about the academic experience and the enrichment that happens in our schools. And we think back to that report from a number of years ago, and I think appreciate some of the flaws that were in that report. Jimmy, you know that I spent 13 years in the classroom, and when I read that report, it, although highlighted some of the capacity opportunities we have across our school district, some of the math that was used, some of the formulas to determine whether or not we had enough academic or classroom space, that we had enough opportunity to teach lab sciences in an appropriate way, that we had an opportunity to do, whether it was art instruction, music instruction, having appropriate theater space and open space for student activities and experiences. There were some flaws in that formula. And I think that that report shouldn't be used to judge. It can guide some of the conversation, but not be used to judge the future of our school facilities. And also it needs to be noted, as Mayor Walsh, then Mayor Walsh, invested $1 billion in the Build BPS plan, which was an extensive facilities plan. And the intention of that work was for some significant improvements, renovations, and rebuilds of our school district. $1 billion touches very few schools. It probably touches about 10 schools out of 125 buildings in a significant way. So we need billions of dollars more. We need to also look at our facilities and our capacity and consider the need for swing space as we do start to renovate and rebuild our schools across the district, and also look towards this conversation around whether it's the World War II era buildings or the more recently built buildings, which are actually in greater disrepair. The World War II buildings are actually our most solid, most sort of strong and well-built buildings. Certainly need significant renovations and retrofitting. The newer buildings are the ones that are literally and figuratively collapsing on our kids. So yes, we need additional investment in our facilities. Yes, we need to make sure that we've got grade configurations right, that we have seats for a changing demographic when we think about the age of our children in each of our neighborhoods, that we have enough seats appropriate for that age group of kids. And when we make those decisions about shifting student populations, whether it's mergers and consolidations or potential closures, that we are doing it in a really thoughtful way and not basing those decisions off of a study that I believe was flawed. Yes, we see in the Boston Public Schools declining enrollment, and I think that that's due in large part to some of the significant failures around the Boston Public Schools. This last year, some real challenges in making sure that our kids were able to access academics, that kids were able to access some of the support services that they rely on during the school day. We saw how important food was for our kids and how we needed to make sure that our kids were fed every day. But within our school district, and you also in that question talk about how important, especially public education, high school or K-12 education is here in the city. They're recruiting new industry, recruiting new companies, retaining and attracting talent. Our schools play an important role in all of those pieces. And if we don't have a K-12 system that is aligned, that grade configurations make sense, that high quality, rigorous academic instruction can be delivered, that there can be special education services that start at the earliest grade, that we have aligned curriculum, that we have literacy that we're teaching, especially in those early grades, that we aren't making thoughtful decisions to support the whole child. And then when it comes to spending, if we aren't answering the question, every $1 we spent, and the city's budget for our Boston Public Schools is $1.3 billion. If we aren't able to answer the question, how is this $1 directly impacting our kids, our students across our district, we are going to continue to fail too many of our kids. I'm committed to that work, from brick and mortar to academic supports to wraparound services and everything in between for our kids. And it is one of the most important jobs, tasks, responsibilities of the mayor of this city. And I look forward to leading on that.
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, my predecessor questioned the validity of that audit. And for me, as someone who is born into a family of educators and spent the majority of my career in education advocacy, you know, I would argue that the focus needs to be on the quality of education and the instruction. We can talk about buildings, and certainly our buildings need some TLC and some investment. And I think COVID underscored that when we're talking about air quality and the need, and as well as climate change. Our buildings are always extremely hot or too cold. And so I think our buildings certainly need some attention, but the real issue for me is the quality of instruction and making sure that we are supporting our educators, supporting our families, and most important, supporting our students.
You know, this is a topic that's extremely personal for me. I am from a family, the oldest kid in an immigrant family, where public education and trying to make sure that my siblings and I were able to really connect with what my parents couldn't offer, the doors that would be open in this country, came through a fierce commitment to connecting us. And every time my dad's salary went up, the family would uproot and move to that next smallest house in the best possible public school district that my parents could afford. And it is what opened doors for me to be able to step into rooms that I never could have imagined growing up. I've also been involved in the Boston Public Schools now as a parent and legal guardian for a decade, first raising my sister in the midst of my mom's mental illness through middle school and high school, and now with my own two boys, both in BPS. When you go and you visit each one of our Boston public schools, you see the range of disparities that are there. It is unacceptable that some of our schools don't have doors on the bathroom stalls or still have lead pipes connected to the drinking fountains, which aren't safe, much less reaching the level of inspiration and academic opportunities, science labs, performing arts spaces that all of our kids deserve. And so it is true, right? Boston's population has gone up and up and up, where the number of kids in our school district has gone down and down. We've seen more than 100,000 additional people added to Boston's population over the last decade, but the number of kids living in our city, much less enrolled in our schools, as a whole has decreased. There are a lot of factors here, and certainly the school system is one piece of it that we need to deliver quality through the facilities, through early education, through vocational training, through wraparound supports across every part of our district. But there's much more than that as to why families are getting pushed out of Boston. Housing costs and transportation access is a key piece of that. And so I want Boston to be the city that is known as the most family-friendly place in America. We know that there are families who want to enroll their students, their kids in Boston public schools, but often don't feel like the seats are in the right places, or they don't feel like they'll have the access to opportunity or resources that we all want for our little ones. We need to really dig in, put a Boston Public Schools mom in charge of our city, and transform what's possible through our school district. That is how we will get to see the real level of interest, of engagement, and the decisions that should be made. One other point on vacancy is sort of the facilities question relative to the number of students in Boston Public Schools. Some of the estimates we have seen have been based on pretty crowded classrooms. And we saw during the pandemic that when we had to all of a sudden ask for desks to be spaced 6 feet apart, our schools couldn't open. There was not enough space. We had to delay, and my son did kindergarten over Zoom because we were not able to think about other facilities. And within the footprint of BPS, there was not adequate space to allow for that kind of ventilation space because our classrooms had been crowded in many cases to begin with. The other point I want to make is that schools should be about much more than just our young people's math, science, and language arts curriculum. Schools should be a hub for the entire community. And so if there are public buildings that we use classrooms in for a certain portion of the day, could we co-locate childcare in some other spaces there? Could we co-locate vocational training for lifelong learning, keep buildings open at night? We need to do a lot more with this precious real estate that we have. Could we redevelop and integrate affordable housing into some of the footprint that we have through BPS and other city buildings? This is how we have to start thinking creatively, proactively, to really wrap around all of the needs that we have with the resources, the tremendous resources that the city of Boston has.